You ever been escorted out of your own office at 2:30 in the afternoon, cardboard box in hand, while the entire floor pretended not to watch? That's how my 14-year career ended publicly, humiliatingly, with our new executive director's smirk burning into my back. They thought they'd won, thought compliance was just paperwork anyone could handle. But buried in my original contract was a clause they never bothered to read. The beautiful thing about legal bombs, they detonate on their own schedule. My name is Aaron Blake, and until 2:30 this afternoon, I was the Chief Compliance Officer at Nexus Technologies in Denver. 14 years of building systems, protecting the company, ensuring every contract was bulletproof. All of it ended in the glass-walled conference room on the 23rd floor, the one with the panoramic view of the Rockies that I'd grown to love. Lucas Grant had called an all-hands meeting for our department. That should have been my first warning. Lucas, our new executive director, had been with us exactly 47 days. Harvard MBA, Silicon Valley pedigree, and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He'd spent those 47 days conducting efficiency evaluations and scheduling one-on-ones that felt more like interrogations. The conference room was packed. My entire team of 12, plus accounting, legal, even some developers who'd wandered in curious. I remember the afternoon sun cutting harsh angles across the table. The nervous tap-tap-tap of Jessica's pen against her notepad. The way conversation died the moment I walked in. Lucas stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back like some general about to address troops. He didn't wait for me to sit. "Thank you all for coming," he began, that practiced corporate smoothness coding every word. "As you know, Nexus is entering a new phase of growth. With new phases come new directions, new strategies, and yes, new leadership structures." My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. 14 years of corporate warfare teaches you to never show blood in the water. "Effective immediately," Lucas continued, his eyes finally landing on me. "We're restructuring the compliance department. Aaron Blake's position has been eliminated." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Someone gasped. Probably Jessica. I heard the scrape of chairs as people shifted uncomfortably, but I didn't look away from Lucas. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items," he added, as if discussing the weather. "We thank you for your years of service." That's when I saw the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough. He'd planned this moment, savored it maybe. The public execution of the old guard to establish his new order. I stood slowly, deliberately, smoothing my blazer. "I'll need my files," I said, voice steady as granite. "All company property remains here," Lucas countered quickly, too quickly. "Personal items only." The security guard, Tom, who I'd helped hire 3 years ago, stood awkwardly by the door, avoiding eye contact. The walk to my office felt endless, every cubicle prairie-dogging to watch the march of shame. My hand stayed steady as I packed coffee mug from the Denver Natural History Museum, the jade plant my daughter gave me, framed photo from the company's 10th anniversary when we were still small enough to fit in one picture. That's when my fingers brushed against the manila folder tucked in my desk's bottom drawer, old paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, my original employment contract from 2010. Back when Peter Lang ran things from a converted warehouse in Rhino. I'd kept it for sentimental reasons, a reminder of hungrier, scrappier days. I slipped it into my box without thinking. Muscle memory of a compliance officer who never throws away original documents. Tom escorted me to the elevator, mumbling apologies. I pretended not to hear. In the lobby, he handed me the official termination letter. "Take care, Aaron," he managed. I didn't respond. The December air hit sharp and clean as I exited onto 17th Street, the box weighing nothing and everything in my arms. Office workers streamed past, absorbed in their phone calls and coffee runs, oblivious to my small apocalypse. It wasn't until I reached my car that I allowed myself to really look at that old contract, its pages soft from age, Peter's signature bold and optimistic, mine careful and precise, and there, on page 12, section 7B, in Harold Pierce's meticulous legal prose, was a clause I'd forgotten existed. a protection Peter had insisted on when he'd poached me from my previous firm, when he'd needed my expertise to build something from nothing. The clause that just changed everything. 14 years ago, Nexus Technologies operated out of a converted warehouse in Rhino, back when the neighborhood was still rough around the edges and rent was cheap. Peter Lang had recruited me from Brennan & Associates, a white-shoe law firm where I'd spent 5 years making senior partners richer while dying slowly in a windowless office reviewing contracts. "I need someone who understands compliance isn't just about saying no," Peter had said over beer at a dive bar on Larimer Street. "I need someone who can build systems that let us say yes without getting sued or arrested." He was 43 then, wild-haired and brilliant, the kind of founder who coded until 3 in the morning and showed up to investor meetings in jeans. I was 24, hungry, and tired of being the youngest person in rooms full of men who looked through me like glass. The early days were chaos, 12 people working 70-hour weeks, pizza boxes stacked like architectural models, whiteboards covered in incomprehensible diagrams that Peter insisted would change the world. My office was a card table next to the server room, the constant hum of machines my background music as I built our compliance infrastructure from scratch. That's when Harold Pierce entered the picture, Peter's college roommate turned corporate lawyer. Harold was everything Peter wasn't: methodical, cautious, pessimistic about human nature. He showed up one evening in October, when Denver's first snow was threatening, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "You're giving Erin too much responsibility without protecting her," Harold told Peter, reviewing my initial employment agreement. "And more importantly, you're not protecting the company's interests if she leaves." They argued for hours while I sat there, 24 years old and trying to look like I belonged in a conversation about intellectual property and non-compete clauses. Finally, Harold pulled out his Mont Blanc and started writing on a legal pad. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "Erin's creating systems that will become essential to your operations. We need to ensure continuity if she leaves voluntarily, but we also need to protect her if you decide to terminate her without cause." Peter laughed. "Why would I fire the person keeping us legal?" Harold's look could have frozen vodka. "Because in 5 years, when you have a board and shareholders and some MBA telling you to cut costs, you might forget this conversation. Trust me on this." That's how Section 7B was born, a mutual protection clause that seemed like overkill at the time. If I left voluntarily, my systems remained with the company. If I was terminated for cause theft, fraud, gross negligence, same deal. But if they terminated me without cause, the licensing agreement for all my compliance frameworks would cease immediately. The company would need my written permission to continue using them. "It's a poison pill," Harold explained to me privately later, hopefully one that never gets swallowed. Peter signed it without hesitation. Back then, he still believed in loyalty, in taking care of the people who built alongside him. The contract went into my desk drawer, and honestly, I forgot about it as Nexus grew. We moved to real offices downtown. We hired 50 people, then 100, then 500. Peter's hair went gray, then white. The dive bars turned into conference rooms. The pizza became catered lunches. 2 years ago, Peter announced his retirement. The board brought in professional management, first CEO Bradley Morrison, who at least understood technology. Then 6 months ago, Lucas Grant, as executive director of operations. Lucas came with a mandate to optimize efficiency and eliminate redundancies. We all knew what that meant. I should have seen my termination coming when Lucas started asking for documentation of all compliance processes and procedures. I spent 3 weeks creating a comprehensive manual, thinking I was proving my value. Instead, I was writing my own obituary. Once he had the playbook, he figured he didn't need the author. What Lucas didn't know, what even our current legal team had forgotten, was that those procedures weren't just institutional knowledge, they were intellectual property, created under a specific legal framework that predated his arrival by over a decade. Harold Pierce had retired to Florida 5 years ago, and Peter was unreachable on his ranch in Aspen. The only copies of that original contract were in the archives and in my bottom desk drawer, saved out of nostalgia for hungrier days. Standing in my kitchen that evening, rereading Harold's precise language, I could almost hear his dry voice. Never underestimate the power of good paperwork. Aaron, it's not dramatic, but it's devastating when deployed correctly. The contract felt heavier than its few pages should warrant. This wasn't just about my pride or even revenge. This was about 14 years of 18-hour days, of building something from nothing, of being told I was essential until the moment I became expendable. Lucas Grant was about to learn what Harold Pierce knew all those years ago: you can't separate the architect from the architecture. Not when the contracts are written right. The cardboard box sat on my passenger seat like a tombstone as I drove home through Denver's afternoon traffic. 14 years reduced to a banker's box of trinkets. My phone buzzed incessantly. Jessica, Marcus from legal, even a few clients who'd somehow already heard. I let them all go to voicemail. There was nothing to say, not yet. At a red light on Spear Boulevard, Lucas's parting words echoed, "The company is moving in a new direction." He'd stood there in his Tom Ford suit, probably bought with his signing bonus, dismantling everything I'd built with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never created anything from scratch. He hadn't even offered the courtesy of a private meeting, a fabricated performance issue, or a generous severance to buy my silence. Just public execution and a security escort. The light turned green. I didn't move immediately, lost in thought until the car behind me honked. That's when I realized Lucas hadn't just been cruel. He'd been careless, arrogant. He'd assumed I would slink away, defeated and silent, another casualty of corporate restructuring. My townhouse in Wash Park felt different when I entered, foreign, like I was trespassing in my own life. I set the box on my kitchen counter and finally pulled out the contract properly, spreading its pages across the granite surface. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating Harold Pierce's precise legal language. Section 7B, Intellectual Property and Operational Continuity. I read it once, twice, a third time to be sure I understood correctly. My pulse quickened, but not with panic. This was something else, the cool, calculating rhythm of a plan forming. The clause was elegant in its simplicity. All compliance frameworks, procedures, and systems I developed remained under a special licensing agreement. If my employment was terminated without cause and Lucas's restructuring certainly qualified the license terminated with it, the company could no longer use my work without explicit written permission. I pulled a legal pad from my home office and began listing everything I'd created: the vendor verification system, the international compliance matrix, the audit protocols that had saved Nexus from 3 different federal investigations. The entire backbone of their operations bore my fingerprints. They'd become so integral, so woven into daily operations, that everyone had forgotten they had an author. My phone rang again. This time I recognized the number: Margaret from HR. I let it ring. Then came a text. "Aaron, we need to discuss your exit paperwork. Please call immediately." Exit paperwork. As if I were some junior analyst who needed to be reminded about COBRA benefits and 401k rollovers. I deleted the message. I poured myself a glass of wine, a good Malbec I'd been saving, and sat on my back deck despite the December chill. The contract lay beside me, weighted down with my coffee mug against the breeze. I didn't need to do anything dramatic. No angry emails, no social media rants, no calls to headhunters or competitors. The beauty of good legal work is that it does its job quietly, invisibly, until the moment it's needed. Lucas thought he'd removed an obstacle, streamlined his new kingdom. He'd probably already had some eager junior executive ready to step into my role tomorrow morning. They'd walk into my former office, access my systems, run my procedures, all while Lucas took credit for the smooth transition. Except they wouldn't be my systems anymore, not legally, not after 5 o'clock today when my termination became official. I took another sip of wine and watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Somewhere across town, in that glass tower, Lucas was probably celebrating, maybe taking his new team out for drinks, toasting to fresh starts and new directions. Let him have his moment. The contract pages rustled in the wind, and I placed my full mug on them to keep them steady. That manila folder, kept out of nostalgia, nearly thrown away a dozen times during office moves, had become a loaded weapon. And the most satisfying part, I didn't have to fire it. Physics would do that for me. Corporate physics, where every action has an equal and opposite reaction. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Peter Lang's old number. Though I knew he'd retired to Aspen 2 years ago, probably someone from the board. Word was traveling fast. I turned the phone face down. Tomorrow, they'd try to access the compliance systems. They'd find themselves locked out, not by any action of mine, but by their own termination of the license. The cascade would begin slowly, a confused IT ticket here, a worried vendor there, then accelerate as they realized the magnitude of what they'd done. I stood, gathered the contract pages carefully, and went inside. There was nothing more to do tonight except wait. I'd been fired at 2:30. By this time tomorrow, they'd understand that they'd fired more than just a person. They'd fired the foundation their house was built on. The wine tasted better with each sip. Outside, Denver's lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in that constellation of offices and ambitions, my little time bomb had already started its countdown. 2 days passed in deliberate silence. I woke at my usual 5:30 a.m., made coffee, and sat in my home office watching the mountains emerge from darkness. My phone stayed on silent, accumulating messages like snowfall, 47 unread texts, 18 missed calls, 12 voicemails I didn't bother playing, the digital debris of corporate panic. By 9 a.m. on Thursday, the first real signs appeared. Jessica texted, "Aaron, something's wrong with the vendor portal. It says access denied. Did you change passwords before leaving?" I didn't respond. Sipped my coffee, watched a fox trot across my backyard, russet against the frost. 10:15 a.m. Marcus from legal. All caps, urgent. Please call immediately. 10:42 a.m. an unknown number that I recognized as our biggest client. Meridian Financial. They left no message. 11 a.m. Margaret from HR again. This time her tone shifted from bureaucratic to worried. "Aaron, we need to discuss some technical issues. Please call me back as soon as possible." I made myself a proper breakfast eggs Benedict, something I never had time for when I was working. The hollandaise took 3 attempts to get right, but I had nowhere else to be. Outside, Denver's December sun turned the snow crystalline. Beautiful day for a corporate crisis. My laptop sat closed on the kitchen counter. I hadn't opened it once since Tuesday. There was nothing to check, no systems to access, no fires to put out. For 14 years, my phone had been a digital leash, yanking me back to problems at all hours. Now it was just an expensive paperweight documenting someone else's emergency. By noon, the texts grew frantic. Jessica again. "The compliance matrix is showing fatal errors. Doug from Meridian called 3 times. What's happening?" Doug Hartley. I'd saved his ass twice from federal audits. He'd sent a bottle of 25-year Macallan each time. Good man, but absolutely allergic to regulatory uncertainty. He was probably sweating through his Hermes tie right about now. 1:23 p.m. A LinkedIn notification. 3 former colleagues had viewed my profile, shopping for my replacement already, or trying to figure out if I'd gone to a competitor I didn't bother checking. The real escalation came at 2:45 p.m. My doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Margaret from HR, looking like she'd driven here in a panic. Her usually perfect bob was wind-tossed, her leather portfolio clutched like a life preserver. I didn't answer. Watched through my office window as she rang again. Waited, then left a manila envelope on my doorstep before retreating to her Audi. After her taillights disappeared, I retrieved the envelope, inside a formal request for transition assistance and critical knowledge transfer, offering me a consulting rate that was insulting even by their standards. I dropped it in my recycling bin, unopened. 3:30 p.m. brought the most interesting development, an email from Bradley Morrison, the CEO who'd preceded Lucas's hiring. Subject line, checking in. The body was careful. Neutral. Heard about the restructuring. Would love to catch up over coffee if you're available. Bradley was smart enough to sense something was wrong, but politically savvy enough not to take sides yet. He was fishing for information, trying to understand why his operations director's simple restructuring was suddenly causing system failures. By 4 p.m., the pattern was clear in the chaos. The vendor verification system, which I'd built to handle Nexus's expansion into government contracts, had locked them out. Without it, they couldn't onboard new suppliers or verify existing ones. The international compliance matrix, essential for their European operations, was throwing errors. The audit protocols that kept them aligned with federal regulations had become inaccessible. They were discovering what I'd known for years. I hadn't just managed compliance. I'd architected it, coded significant portions of it, and held the intellectual property rights to all of it. Every efficiency Lucas thought he was gaining by eliminating my position was being erased by the systems failing in my absence. My neighbor, Sharon, knocked around 5 p.m. with a bottle of wine and curious eyes. "Saw you were home during the day? Everything okay?" "Never better," I said, accepting the wine. "Early retirement." She knew better than to push. That's what I loved about Denver. Everyone had a story, and everyone knew when not to ask for it. As darkness fell, I opened the wine Sharon had brought, a nice Chateauneuf du Pape. My phone battery had died sometime around 4, and I didn't bother charging it. Tomorrow would bring more panic, more desperate attempts to understand how their compliance infrastructure had vanished like morning mist. They'd probably try to rebuild it from scratch, not understanding that it had taken 14 years to construct, piece by careful piece. Lucas was probably in a conference room right now, trying to explain to Bradley and the board how a simple headcount reduction had turned into an operational crisis. I wondered if he'd kept that smirk from Tuesday, wondered if anyone had told him yet about Section 7B, or if legal was still frantically searching through archives, trying to understand what had gone so catastrophically wrong. The wine was excellent. Sharon had good taste. I raised my glass to the darkening sky, to Harold Pierce in his Florida retirement, to Peter Lang on his ranch, to all the careful legal work that sits dormant until the moment it's needed. They thought they were firing a person. They were about to learn they'd fired a foundation. Friday morning, 9 a.m. sharp, inside Nexus Technologies' 23rd floor, the executive conference room had transformed into a war room. I wasn't there, of course, but Jessica Loyal. Jessica, who'd worked under me for 6 years, texted me the play-by-play despite my silence. Her messages painted a picture I could see perfectly. Lucas Grant stood at the whiteboard, his usual corporate polish cracking at the edges. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled up, that Harvard MBA confidence evaporating like rubbing alcohol. Around the table, Bradley Morrison, CEO, Diane Walters, CFO, 3 lawyers from Brennan and Associates. My old firm, ironically, and 2 emergency IT consultants, charging $1,500 an hour to tell them what I could have explained in 5 minutes. How does an entire compliance infrastructure just stop working? Bradley's voice, according to Jessica, had lost its usual measured tone. Systems don't just die because one person leaves. Lucas tried to maintain control. "We're investigating potential sabotage. Maybe Ms. Blake." "She hasn't accessed anything," interrupted Kevin from IT, laptop open, sweat beading on his forehead. "I've checked every log. She hasn't touched our system since Tuesday at 2:28 p.m. This isn't hacking. The systems are working exactly as designed." That's when Diane spoke up, having spent the night reviewing financial implications. Meridian Financial has frozen their contract pending compliance verification. That's $18 million annually. Stuttgart office can't process new EU contracts without the compliance matrix. Another $12 million at risk. The numbers started stacking like bodies on a battlefield. Every system I'd built had tentacles reaching into revenue streams they'd never thought to map. The vendor verification system alone handled relationships worth over $100 million in annual contracts. Marcus from Legal Poor Marcus, who'd joined only last year, had found something in the archives. There's a contract from 2010, Original Employment Agreement for Aaron Blake. Section 7B discusses intellectual property rights and licensing agreements. The room went silent. Jessica said you could hear the HVAC system humming. Bradley's response was volcanic. "Are you telling me she owns our compliance systems?" "Not owns," Marcus corrected, his voice barely above a whisper. "She licensed them to us. The license was contingent on her employment, when we terminated her without cause." "The license terminated too," finished Sandra Brennan, senior partner at Brennan and Associates, her hourly rate high enough to fund a small nonprofit. "It's ironclad. Harold Pierce wrote this. He was one of our best before he retired. There's no wiggle room." Lucas's face had gone from red to white to a concerning shade of gray. "But she built these systems on company time, with company resources." "Doesn't matter," Sandra cut him off. Read the contract. It specifically states that all compliance frameworks, methodologies, and systems developed by Ms. Blake remain her intellectual property, licensed exclusively to Nexus during her employment. It's unusual, but it's legal, and it's binding. The IT consultants confirmed what everyone was beginning to understand: they couldn't just rebuild the systems. It wasn't just code, it was 14 years of iterative design, relationships with regulatory bodies, institutional knowledge encoded in algorithms and procedures. The documentation I'd helpfully provided to Lucas 3 weeks ago, useless without the underlying IP rights.
How much to get her back? Bradley asked.
She's not answering calls. Margaret from HR spoke for the first time. I went to her house yesterday. She wouldn't answer the door.
What about a lawsuit?
Lucas grasped for solutions. Breach of contract. Theft of trade secrets. Sandra's laugh was harsh. Sue her for honoring a contract we signed, for following the exact terms we agreed to. We'd be laughed out of court. Worse, it would go public. Imagine the headlines: tech company sues former executive for following contract they signed. The discussion turned to damage control. Without the compliance systems, they had 72 hours before they'd be in violation of federal reporting requirements. The EU would start fining them Monday. Meridian would pull out entirely if they couldn't provide compliance verification by end of business today.
What does she want? Bradley finally asked, the only question that mattered.
Nobody had an answer. I hadn't demanded anything, hadn't made threats, hadn't even responded to their increasingly desperate attempts at contact. The silence was more terrifying than any demand would have been. Jessica's final text from the meeting. Lucas just offered his resignation. Bradley told him to fix this first, then resign. I put my phone down and went for a run through Wash Park. The December air bit at my lungs, clean and sharp. Joggers nodded as they passed. Dogs chased tennis balls across frost-brittle grass. The world continued its rotation, indifferent to corporate catastrophes. By the time I returned home, there were 3 cars parked outside my townhouse. Lawyers, probably, or maybe board members. I took a longer route, entering through my back gate. Let them wait. Let them sit in their heated leather seats, watching my empty doorway, understanding what it felt like to be powerless. Inside, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, sketching out what a fair severance package would look like. Not revenge, just fairness. 14 years of building their empire deserved more than a cardboard box and a security escort. But I wouldn't call them, wouldn't draft proposals or make demands. Harold Pierce had taught me that too. The person who speaks first in a negotiation loses, and right now, their desperation was speaking volumes. The archives at Nexus Technologies lived in the basement, a forgotten kingdom of bankers' boxes and filing cabinets that nobody visited unless legal demanded it. At 3 p.m. on Friday, a procession descended into that fluorescent purgatory. Sandra Brennan and 2 junior associates from her firm, Marcus from legal, and a sweating Lucas Grant, who looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days. They were hunting for paper, the original documents that predated digital conversion. The contract I'd taken was my copy, but somewhere in those boxes was theirs, with original signatures and notarizations that would confirm what they desperately hoped wasn't true. The first 4 boxes yielded nothing but old tax documents and expired NDAs. Box 5 had real estate leases from the warehouse days. Box 6 through 12 contained Peter Lang's early investor agreements, handwritten notes in margins like archaeological evidence of Nexus's birth. "Found it," whispered one of the junior associates at 4:20 p.m., pulling a manila folder from box 13. The label, typed on an actual typewriter, read, E. Blake, Employment Agreement, October 2010. Sandra Brennan adjusted her reading glasses and opened the folder like it might explode. There it was, 15 pages of careful legal construction. Harold Pierce's name embossed on the letterhead. Signatures in blue ink. Peter Lang's enthusiastic scrawl. My careful cursive. Harold's witness signature. And a notary seal from the state of Colorado. She read Section 7B aloud, her voice echoing in the basement. All compliance frameworks, systems, procedures, and methodologies developed by employee Aaron Blake during the term of employment shall remain the intellectual property of employee, licensed exclusively to company for the duration of employee's employment. This license is non-transferable and terminates immediately upon employee's termination without cause, resignation with notice, or retirement. Company acknowledges that these systems are proprietary work product of employee, developed through employee's unique expertise and methodological approach. Lucas grabbed the contract, reading it himself as if the words might change under his stare. This can't be enforceable. She was our employee. Look at the subsection. Sandra pointed to the next paragraph. In consideration of this intellectual property arrangement, company agrees to compensate employee with an additional 5% equity stake, vested over 4 years. She was paid for these rights. This isn't work for hire. It's a licensing agreement. Marcus had pulled up something on his laptop. I found the equity records. She received the full 5%, fully vested in 2014. Current value approximately. He paused, calculating. $42 million. So we paid her $42 million for systems we don't own. Lucas's voice cracked. No, Sandra corrected. You paid her for the right to use those systems while she worked here. The equity was compensation for that arrangement. It's actually brilliant. Harold Pierce created a perfect poison pill. As long as you kept Erin employed, you had full use of everything she built. The moment you terminated her without cause. We lost everything. Bradley Morrison had appeared in the doorway, having come down himself to see the document. Lucas, explain to me how you fired someone without reviewing their original employment agreement. She was redundant, Lucas stammered. Her salary was $800,000 annually. I was streamlining. You streamlined us into a compliance crisis that's going to cost us millions. Bradley's voice was ice. Meridian just formally suspended their contract. Deutsche Bank is asking questions about our European compliance status. The feds are requesting documentation we can no longer generate. Sandra had continued reading, finding more devastating details. There's a non-compete clause here, but it only applies if she leaves voluntarily or is terminated for cause. Termination without cause voids it. She could go to our biggest competitor tomorrow and rebuild everything for them. Or start her own compliance consulting firm, Marcus added quietly, with our entire client list knowing our systems just failed. The junior associate who'd found the contract spoke up hesitantly. There's a restoration clause. Page 14. Everyone turned to page 14. Sandra read, in the event of license termination due to termination without cause, company may petition employee for restoration of license under new terms to be negotiated in good faith. Employee is under no obligation to agree to restoration. So we can get the systems back. Lucas grasped at hope. If she agrees, Sandra emphasized, and at whatever price she sets, she holds all the cards. Bradley pulled out his phone, dialing a number from memory. They all heard it ring once, twice, 3 times, then my voicemail. This is Erin Blake. I'm currently unavailable. If this is regarding Nexus Technologies, please submit all communications through legal counsel. I'd recorded that message this morning, anticipating this moment. Get Peter Lang on the phone, Bradley ordered. Maybe he can talk to her. Marcus shook his head. I tried. He's in Nepal. Some meditation retreat with no communications. Harold Pierce. Retired. His wife says he's deep-sea fishing in the Keys. Won't be back for 2 weeks. The basement felt smaller suddenly. The weight of 14 years of careful legal construction pressing down on them. They'd found what they were looking for, but it wasn't salvation. It was confirmation of their catastrophe. What about the documentation she provided 3 weeks ago? Lucas asked desperately. Can't we just rebuild based on that? Sandra's look could have withered stone. Did you read the copyright notice on that documentation? All procedures and methodologies contained herein remain the intellectual property of Erin Blake. Reproduction without written permission is prohibited. You can't rebuild it. You can't modify it. You can't even use it as reference without her permission. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere above them, the Friday afternoon exodus had begun. Employees heading home for the weekend, unaware that by Monday, their company might be facing federal investigations, client lawsuits, and the complete collapse of their compliance infrastructure. How much? Bradley finally asked. How much to make this go away? Sandra gathered the contract pages carefully. That's the $42 million question, literally. She already has $42 million in equity. What could you possibly offer that she needs? The answer hung in the stale basement air. Nothing. They had nothing she needed, only things she might want. And after Tuesday's public humiliation, what Aaron Blake might want was something money couldn't buy, watching them squirm in the trap they'd built themselves. Saturday morning broke with unusual warmth for December, the kind of day that made Denverites remember why they tolerated the snow. I was at my kitchen table, reading the Financial Times, when my doorbell rang at 8:45 a.m. Through the peephole, Bradley Morrison himself, looking like he'd slept in his Tesla. I didn't answer, let him wait, but Bradley was smarter than Lucas. He didn't ring again. Instead, he sat on my porch steps and pulled out his phone. 30 seconds later, my personal email chimed. Aaron, I'm outside, not here to negotiate or pressure you. Just want to apologize. You deserved better, Bradley. I watched him through my window. He sat there in his $4,000 suit on my frozen steps, CEO of a billion-dollar company, reduced to waiting like a supplicant. After 10 minutes, I opened the door. Coffee, I asked. His relief was palpable. Please. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd first read Section 7B 3 days ago. Bradley looked older, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. The board is in emergency session, he said without preamble. We've lost $60 million in